The city was a restless beast, its heartbeat a constant thrum of noise and light. In the nicer part of town, where the lights were softer and the noise was a more subdued hum, stood the restaurant called Garden of the Moon. It was a haven of quiet elegance, where the air perpetually carried the scent of ginger, garlic, and roasting meats. The tables were made of dark, polished wood, and the staff moved with a silent, graceful efficiency that made every customer feel valued. This was where Kletchy found herself on a Tuesday evening, her first full week on the job. The uniform, a deep blue hanbok, felt both foreign and exquisite against her skin. She handled it with care, smoothing the silky fabric as she meticulously arranged polished chopsticks at an unoccupied table. Kletchy was new to the city, having journeyed from a much smaller, more peaceful place with a dream in her heart and very little money in her pocket. This job was her first real opportunity, and she was determined to excel. She observed the other waitresses, noting how they glided between tables, their voices soft and melodic as they described the daily specials. She practiced the names of the dishes in her head: bibimbap, galbi, japchae. The manager, Mr. Park, was a stern man who rarely smiled, but he was fair. He had emphasized that the most important rule was to make the customers feel both comfortable and discreetly observed. It was a delicate balance, and Kletchy's hands still sometimes trembled when she carried the heavy stoneware bowls. As the evening progressed, the sky outside the large windows deepened into a bruised purple. Rain began to fall, starting with gentle taps before evolving into a steady, drumming downpour that blurred the glass. The restaurant, which had been comfortably busy, began to empty out. Kletchy was starting to think her shift would end quietly, when the door suddenly opened. A rush of wet, cold air swept in, followed by 3 men. They weren't particularly loud or rude, but their arrival dramatically altered the atmosphere of the room. The air seemed to thicken and grow still. The soft chatter from the remaining tables faded away. Mr. Park, who had been totaling a receipt, immediately straightened his posture, his face adopting a carefully neutral expression. The man leading the group was the one who captured everyone's attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dark coat that dripped rainwater onto the expensive floor. His hair was black and meticulously styled, and his face was composed of sharp, serious angles. He remained silent, but one of the men accompanying him gestured towards the best table in the house, a secluded booth in the corner. Mr. Park hurried over, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Kim," he said, his voice respectful, "your usual table is ready." The tall man, Mr. Kim, responded with a single, slow nod. As he walked, his eyes scanned the room, not with idle curiosity, but with a sense of cool ownership. They were dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail and find it wanting. Kletchy felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. This was clearly a very important and potentially very dangerous man. Mr. Park returned to the service station, his face noticeably pale. He looked directly at Kletchy. "Kletchy," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You will serve table 9, the gentleman in the corner. Be perfect. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Just take their order and bring the food. Do you understand?" Kletchy's mouth went dry. She nodded, unable to find her voice. She grabbed a notepad and a pitcher of ice water, her hands feeling suddenly clumsy and unfamiliar. As she approached the table, she could feel the weight of their silence. The other 2 men watched her with unreadable expressions. The main man, Mr. Kim, was engrossed in his phone, completely ignoring her presence. "Good evening," Kletchy stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "May I bring you something to drink?" One of the other men waved a dismissive hand. "Just water and the usual food order. The boss knows what he wants." Kletchy nodded, pouring the water with a hand that shook just enough to make the ice cubes clink too loudly against the glass. When she poured for Mr. Kim, he still didn't acknowledge her. She felt a wave of relief and quickly retreated to the kitchen to place the order. The food was prepared quickly. A selection of small side dishes called banchan, followed by sizzling platters of grilled meat, and finally a large, heavy stoneware pot filled with a boiling hot seafood and tofu soup. The pot, called a jjigae, was steaming and bubbling furiously, the red broth looking ominous. It was the main dish, and it was for Mr. Kim. Kelechi took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She carefully lifted the tray, balancing the heavy hot pot in the center. The walk from the kitchen to the corner table felt like an eternity. She focused on her feet and on keeping the tray level. The heat from the pot seeped through the tray handles into her palms. She could hear the low murmur of the men's voices growing louder as she got closer. Just a few more steps. One of the other men shifted in his seat, starting to stand up to make room. In his movement, his elbow accidentally bumped sharply against Kelechi's arm. It was a small bump, but it was enough. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The tray tilted precariously. The heavy stoneware pot slid, teetered on the edge, and then crashed onto the table. A wave of scalding red soup and chunks of tofu and seafood splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, over the men's expensive suits, and directly onto Mr. Kim's lap. A deafening silence fell over the entire restaurant. The only sound was the final dull thud of the empty pot as it rolled off the table and onto the floor. Kelechi stood frozen, her hands empty, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt lightheaded. The two other men were on their feet, furiously brushing at their clothes, their faces contorted in anger. But Kelechi's eyes were locked on Mr. Kim. He had moved with surprising speed, pushing his chair back to avoid the worst of the spill, but his trousers were still visibly stained. Slowly, very slowly, he looked up from the mess on his lap. His dark eyes, cold and hard, met hers. Tears of pure terror welled up in Kelechi's eyes. She was going to be fired. She was going to be yelled at. She was sure she was going to have to pay for the meal and the ruined clothes, which probably cost more than she made in a month. Her new life in the city was over before it had even truly begun. Mr. Kim stood up. He was even taller than she had realized, and he seemed to tower over her. He looked her up and down, from her frightened eyes to her shaking hands. Kelechi braced herself for the outburst, for the storm of his anger, but it didn't come. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and calm, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You're too small for this job," he said, his gaze unwavering. Kelechi felt the words like a physical blow, a confirmation of all her deepest fears. But then he continued, his tone shifting into something that wasn't quite kindness, but was undeniably absolute authority. "But don't worry, I'll make it fit." He turned his head slightly, just enough to address the stunned Mr. Park, who was wringing his hands a few feet away. "Clean this up," he said, his voice still quiet, but leaving no room for argument. "Bring a new meal and bring the young lady a new uniform. This one is stained." He then looked back at Kelechi. The coldness in his eyes had softened just a fraction, replaced by something more akin to curiosity. "What is your name?" he asked. Took her a moment to find her voice. "Kelechi," she whispered. He repeated it as if tasting the word. "Kelechi." He gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. Then he sat back down in his chair, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around him, as if nothing had happened at all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Kelechi. She changed her uniform. The table was reset. A new, perfect meal was served. Mr. Kim and his men ate in silence. When they were finished and ready to leave, Mr. Kim walked past the service station. He stopped in front of Kelechi, who was trying to look busy by polishing already clean glasses. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded stack of money, and placed it neatly on the counter in front of her. It was a tip, but it was more money than she had ever seen at one time. Then he turned and walked out into the rain, his men following behind him like shadows. Kelechi stood there staring at the money, then at the door where he had disappeared. Her heart was still racing, but the fear had been replaced by a whirlwind of confusion. He wasn't what she had expected. He was powerful and intimidating, but he had also been fair. The words echoed in her mind. "I'll make it fit." She didn't know what they meant. Not really, but a strange, warm feeling began to push aside the cold dread in her stomach. This was not the end of her story. It felt, for the first time that night, like a very strange beginning. The days that followed the spill were filled with a tense anticipation for Kletchy. Every time the restaurant door opened, her heart would do a little flip, her eyes darting towards the entrance, half expecting and half fearing the return of the imposing Mr. Kim. But he didn't come. The large tip he had left remained tucked safely in her small apartment, a tangible reminder of the bizarre encounter that felt more and more like a vivid dream. She fell back into the rhythm of her new life, learning the menu, mastering the delicate art of setting a Korean table, and navigating the bustling, unfamiliar streets of the city. The initial terror of that night began to dissipate, replaced by a nagging curiosity about the man who had the power to silence a room with his mere presence. It was exactly 1 week later, on another rainy evening, that he returned. This time he was alone. The clock showed 15 minutes until closing, and the restaurant was nearly empty, save for a single couple settling their bill. Kletchy was in the back wiping down counters when she heard Mr. Park's voice, suddenly alert and respectful. She peered out and saw Mr. Kim standing just inside the doorway, shaking the rain from his dark coat. He was less formal tonight, dressed in a simple black sweater that made him seem slightly less like a king and more like a man, albeit a profoundly serious one. Mr. Park gestured for Kletchy. "Table 9, he said, his voice a mixture of command and unspoken warning. "He has asked for you." The walk to the table felt even longer than it had the night of the spill. Her palms were damp, but this time it was a different kind of nervousness. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was watching her approach, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with a quiet, focused intensity. She stopped a respectful distance from the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Good evening, Mr. Kim," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Kletchy," he replied, and the way he said her name, with a certain weight and consideration, made it sound entirely new. "I will have the doenjang jjigae and a pot of barley tea." It was a simple, humble order, a comforting stew, not the lavish feast from his previous visit. She brought the tea first, her movements careful and precise. As she set the small teapot and cup on the table, he spoke again, his voice low. "The restaurant is quiet tonight." "It is, sir," she replied, unsure of what else to say. "The rain keeps people away." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights were smeared by the rain on the glass. "It is a good night for quiet." He looked back at her. "You are not from this city." It wasn't a question, but a statement. "No, sir," Kletchy answered. "I'm from a small town. It's very different here." "Tell me about it," he said, and he leaned back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. And so, haltingly at first, she did. She told him about the wide-open fields behind her grandmother's house, where the sky felt enormous. She spoke of the loud, joyful chaos of family gatherings, so different from the polite silence of the restaurant. She found herself talking about her dream of going to school to study design, of creating beautiful things with her hands. He listened, truly listened, without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't seem bored or impatient. "You seem interested." When his food arrived, he gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him for a moment. "You should take a break," he said. It was less a suggestion and more a gentle command. So she sat just for a few minutes while he ate a few spoonfuls of the stew. He asked her more questions about her family, about what she missed from home. The conversation was like a delicate dance, each step cautious and measured. This became their new routine. He would appear in the final hour before closing, always alone. He would sit at table 9, order a simple meal, and ask for Kletchy. Their talks grew longer, stretching past closing time. Mr. Park would eventually leave, throwing a complex, unreadable look at Kletchy before locking the front door and leaving through the back, leaving them alone in the soft, ambient light of the cleaned restaurant. It was during these conversations that the fortress around Juno, for he had told her his first name one night, the word feeling like a secret he was entrusting to her, began to show cracks. He told her about the heavy responsibilities he carried, the business his father had built that now rested entirely on his shoulders. He spoke of the loneliness that came with his position, how people saw the title of boss, but never saw the man, Juno, who found peace in the quiet strokes of a paintbrush, who loved the works of old Korean poets. He confessed that the restaurant was one of the few places where he could simply sit and be, away from the constant demands and expectations. Kelechi listened, and in listening, she began to see the lonely boy inside the powerful man. One evening, a group of loud, boisterous men came in just as Juno was about to leave. They had been drinking, and their energy was aggressive and out of place in the calm space. One of them, a large man with a booming voice, kept snapping his fingers at Kelechi, demanding more beer, making crude comments about her in a language he wrongly assumed she didn't understand. She tried to remain professional, but her discomfort was palpable. As she approached their table with another bottle, the loud man reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight and insistent, pulling her slightly towards him as he slurred a joke to his friends. Kelechi froze, a jolt of fear and revulsion coursing through her. Before she could even attempt to pull away, a shadow fell over the table. Juno was there. He hadn't moved quickly or made a sound, but his presence was suddenly immense, filling the entire space around them. He didn't look at Kelechi. His entire focus was on the man holding her wrist. His face was a calm, cold mask, but his eyes held a terrifying promise of violence. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud. It was, in fact, quieter than a whisper, but it cut through the men's laughter like a shard of ice. The drunk man, startled, looked up and met Juno's gaze. The color drained from his face. He released Kelechi's wrist immediately, as if her skin had burned him. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't," he stammered. Juno did not reply. He simply continued to look at the man, his expression unchanging, until the man dropped his eyes and mumbled an apology to the table. Juno then turned his body, creating a shield between Kelechi and the table. He gently took her elbow and guided her away, back towards the safety of the service station. His touch was firm yet incredibly gentle. Once they were away from the table, he turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice returning to the softer tone he reserved only for her. She shook her head, her whole body trembling from the adrenaline. "No, I'm okay." He reached out, and his fingers, warm and steady, brushed against the skin of her wrist where the man had grabbed her. The touch sent a completely different kind of shiver through her, a warm, electric current that chased away the last of the fear. He looked down at the faint red marks on her skin, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. When he looked back into her eyes, the cold anger was gone, replaced by a deep, smoldering intensity. "No one," he said, his voice low and fervent, "will ever make you feel small again. I promise you this." In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a feeling that had been growing for weeks. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his body. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't. She rose onto her toes to meet him. Their first kiss was not a timid brush of lips. It was a confirmation, a culmination of a promise. It was soft yet certain, filled with all the unspoken words and shared understandings of the past weeks. It tasted of barley tea and longing and a fierce, protective warmth. When they finally parted, the world around them, the messy table, the silent restaurant, the rain outside had simply faded away. They stood forehead to forehead, breathing each other's air, and Kelechi knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her life had irrevocably changed direction. This was no longer just a strange job in a big city. This was the beginning of something she could never have dreamed of. The world outside the quiet sanctuary of the restaurant began to intrude. The secret hours that Kelechi and Juno stole for themselves, walking through deserted midnight parks or talking for hours in his sleek, dark car, felt like a beautiful dream from which a harsh awakening was inevitable. Juno's world, the world of the family business, was not one that easily accepted outsiders, and certainly not one that welcomed change. Whispers began to circulate among the men who had followed Juno for years. They saw the way his stern focus had softened. They noticed how his phone, which was usually a constant extension of his hand, would sometimes remain ignored in his pocket while he shared a quiet smile with the waitress from Garden of the Moon. To them, this was not romance. It was a distraction. It was a crack in the armor of their leader, and cracks were seen as weaknesses to be exploited. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A car would follow Klechy at a distance on her walk home, its headlights a silent, menacing presence. Then one of the senior men, a grim-faced figure named Sangwon, who had been with Juno's father, came to the restaurant. He did not speak to Klechy, but he sat at a table for a long time, his cold eyes watching her every move, his disapproval a tangible chill in the warm room. Mr. Park grew increasingly nervous, often suggesting to Klechy that perhaps she should consider a job at a different restaurant, one in a less complicated part of the city. Juno knew what was happening. He could feel the shifting loyalties, the unspoken challenges. He tried to shield Klechy from it, wrapping her in a protective bubble of his presence. But she was not a woman who could remain oblivious for long. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach whenever she saw the unfamiliar car or felt Sangwon's gaze. But a stronger emotion began to rise within her, one that had been forged in her own grandmother's kitchen. A spirit of fierce resilience. She would not be intimidated. She would not be made to feel insignificant. The confrontation came on a night when Juno was away, handling business he could not postpone. Sangwon and two other men entered the restaurant just after closing. Mr. Park had already left, and Klechy was alone, wiping down the last tables. The sound of the lock on the front door clicking shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent space. "Little girl," Sangwon said, his voice rough, "you have been having fun, yes? Playing a game you do not understand." He walked slowly towards her, his shoes echoing on the floor. "You are a hobby for him, a pretty distraction, but hobbies are eventually forgotten. You are casting a shadow over this family. You make him vulnerable. It is time for you to disappear." Klechy's heart hammered frantically against her ribs. But she stood her ground, clutching the damp cloth in her hand like a lifeline. She thought of Juno's confession of loneliness, of the gentle way he held her face when he kissed her, of the man who loved poetry and art hidden beneath the image of the powerful boss. "You are wrong," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not a shadow, and I don't make him vulnerable." She took a small step forward, her chin held high. "You are afraid. You are afraid because he is changing, and you don't know how to exist in a world that isn't built on fear. But I'm not afraid of you. The only thing I'm afraid of is a life without him in it." Sangwon's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. Her defiance was not part of his plan. He took another step, but at that moment, the back door to the kitchen burst open. Juno stood there, his chest heaving, his face a storm of cold, controlled rage. He had returned early, a feeling of dread gnawing at him, and he had heard everything. What happened next was not a loud, dramatic fight. It was something far more decisive. Juno walked to Klechy's side, placing himself squarely between her and Sangwon. He did not shout. He spoke in low, measured tones. His words meant only for the men in the room. He spoke of legacy, not the one built on intimidation, but one that could be built on strength and respect. He spoke of his father's dreams, which were not just for power, but for a lasting, honorable family. And then, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more frightening than any shout, he made it clear. She's not a distraction to me. She is my future. If anyone has a problem with my future, they've got a problem with me, and that's a war they are absolutely not going to win. The silence that followed hung heavy in the air, absolute and complete. Sangwon's gaze shifted back and forth, from Juno's unwavering face to Klechy's display of bravery. He saw not weakness, but a newfound, unbreakable kind of strength emanating from them. He gave a curt, defeated nod, and he and the other men quietly retreated without another word exchanged. In the hush that settled over the space after they had gone, Juno turned his attention to Klechy. He immediately pulled her close, enveloping her in a tight embrace, burying his face in the softness of her hair. When I heard his voice, he whispered, his voice thick and raw with emotion, I have never known such fear. Weeks later, they stood together on the rooftop of his building. The sprawling city spread out beneath them like an endless blanket of twinkling stars. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Juno had undergone a complete transformation. He had dismantled the old, fear-inducing aspects of his business, carefully constructing something new, something legitimate and undeniably strong. The weight that had seemed to perpetually bow his shoulders was finally gone, lifted completely. He stood tall, feeling truly free for the first time in what seemed like forever. He gently took both of Kletchy's hands in his thumbs stroking her knuckles with a tender touch. You walked into my life like a storm, he began, a soft, genuine smile gracing his lips. You spilled soup, and you turned my ordered, gray world into an absolute riot of color. You saw the man behind the title and you weren't afraid. You stood for me when others stood against me. You fit into my life, Kletchy, not by changing who you are, but by making my life the right shape for you. He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, breathtaking ring, a single, flawless diamond that caught and reflected the starlight, making it sparkle with an otherworldly glow. You are my courage and my peace, he continued, his voice filled with heartfelt emotion. Will you build this new, beautiful life with me? Will you stay with me forever? Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Kletchy's face as she looked from the stunning ring to the loving face of the man standing before her. The man who had promised her he would make things fit, and who had, in every conceivable way, kept his word. Yes, she whispered, her voice overflowing with love and emotion. Yes, Juno, forever. As he carefully slipped the ring onto her finger, the final piece of their intricate puzzle clicked perfectly into place. Their unique love story, which had begun with a trembling waitress and a terrifying boss, had been tested by fire, weathering every challenge, and had ultimately been forged into something truly unbreakable and enduring. It was a story about finding courage in the most unexpected of places, and of discovering that forever could, in fact, begin with a single life-changing spill. Did their journey of building a brand new life together capture your heart and stir your emotions? If you want to discover more unique and captivating love stories that blossom against all odds, be sure to subscribe for future tales.